It was the kind of afternoon that should have felt warm, even if only symbolically. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, soft and golden, pooling over the table I had spent all morning setting. The dishes were the good ones, my mother's porcelain, with the delicate blue edges, and the table runner was the one I embroidered decades ago, back when I still believed special days were about creating memories, not obligations. A cake sat at the center vanilla, with buttercream her favorite. Or at least it used to be. Lately, I was never quite sure what she liked anymore. I had also baked lemon scones and prepared a fruit salad with the oranges she used to sneak from the bowl as a child. I thought of that, her tiny fingers sticky with juice, as I lined the strawberries in neat rows. But those memories felt like someone else's now, like I'd dreamed them up in another life. They all came in eventually. My daughter, her husband, a few of their friends I'd never met before. Perfume and laughter entered with them both too strong. She barely looked at me when I opened the door. Her smile was half there, like she was holding it for someone else, and when I leaned in to hug her, she turned just slightly, like I was wind she had to walk through. I didn't say anything. I just held my breath the way I've learned to do with her. The others followed, young women in sleek coats and loud heels, men with that look of practiced charm. They all complimented the house with the same emptiness, tossing words like throw pillows just to fill space. We sat. I poured tea. I passed plates. I asked questions that got one-word answers. It felt like trying to pet a cat that didn't want to be touched. Every gesture came back cold. I could feel how they humored me, like I was a required presence, like someone had drawn a box around me with the word obligation, and they were just waiting for the evening to end. And I tried Lord. I tried to smile, to make conversation, to forget the little glances exchanged across the table whenever I told a story or made a joke. They didn't laugh. My daughter would sip her drink and say, "You're so funny, Mom," but her eyes didn't match her words. She blew out the candles, all 32 of them, and I clapped even though no one else did more than murmur. The cake was moist. I made sure of that. The slices went untouched by some. A few pushed theirs around the plate. My granddaughter didn't come. I wasn't told why. My daughter didn't mention her once. When she opened my gift, a handmade quilt I'd been stitching for 6 months, she pulled it out, slowly looked at the pattern, and smiled with that same flat expression. "Oh," she said, "it's very homey." The others laughed lightly, like she'd made a joke they weren't sure was safe to laugh at. I just nodded and said I was glad she liked it. She folded it too quickly, shoving it into a gift bag without a second glance. I wanted to tell her about the hidden embroidery, her initials stitched in the corner the way I picked colors to match her childhood bedroom walls, but I didn't. There wasn't space for tenderness at that table. Instead, I went back to the kitchen to get the coffee. I stood for a moment with the pot in my hand, listening to the chatter behind me. I told myself I should be happy. She was here. They were here. But something inside me had begun to cool. The kind of cold that doesn't come from the air, but from the way someone looks at you, like they're waiting for you to disappear. And even though I carried the tray out, still smiling, something inside me whispered that this birthday was different. Something had cracked. The laughter echoed across the living room, bouncing off the picture frames I had dusted that morning, the walls that had cradled generations of birthdays before hers. But this laughter, hers, was different now. It had an edge to it, a kind of brittle cruelty that I hadn't heard before. She laughed easily, yes, but never at my jokes anymore. Only at things I didn't understand. Comments whispered from her friends, inside references that shut me out like a locked door. I sat with my teacup in my lap, the saucer balanced carefully, like it might give me dignity if I held it just right. One of her friends had said something, I didn't catch it, but it made her laugh so hard she nearly choked on her wine. "You're terrible," she said, touching her friend's arm, head thrown back. They all laughed with her. I smiled reflexively politely. No one noticed. It reminded me of when she was little, how she used to laugh in this house. Full-bodied, pure, unfiltered joy that rang through the halls. I used to stand in the kitchen flour on my hands and just close my eyes to listen. I could have bottled that sound. But this wasn't laughter meant to be shared. It was a signal, a shield, a performance, something to remind me that I was not invited into that world anymore. She barely looked in my direction. Occasionally she'd call out, "Mom, can you grab more napkins?" Or, "Do you have oat milk always?" with a tone that danced on the line between condescension and command. I obliged. Of course I did. What else does a mother do but serve and smile? When I sat back down, I found her in the center of the room spinning a story about her new job. She used words like elite and executive and impact, none of which sounded like the vocabulary of the girl who once cried when her goldfish died. Her voice had changed, too lower, more performative, like she was auditioning for something. Everyone clapped when she described turning down a promotion because the vibe wasn't right. I didn't understand it, but I clapped too. The whole evening moved like a play I wasn't cast in. I moved around the edges, picking up empty glasses, resetting cushions, making sure no one needed anything. Not because they asked, but because that's what I'd always done. I used to think that was love, the silent giving, the background caretaking. Now it felt like erasure in slow motion. She glanced at me once, during the storytelling, just once, and I caught something in her eyes. Not anger, not even resentment, just disinterest. Like I was someone else's mother. Like I had wandered into the wrong party. I excused myself after a while, retreating to the back hallway under the pretense of checking on something in the laundry room. But really I just needed to breathe. To remember that I was more than a coat rack, that once long ago I was the center of her world. The hallway was quiet, dim. I stood there with my hands wrapped around each other, holding them like a prayer. I tried not to cry. It wasn't the right moment. Not in my own house. Not on her birthday. I told myself I was being sensitive, that maybe she was just tired, that maybe I was imagining the distance. But then I heard it clear as day, her voice sharp and flippant, carried by the floorboards like a knife through velvet. "I hope this is her last birthday," she said. And then laughter, again. Not mine. It's strange the way youth can make someone forget the hands that raised them. It was in the small things that evening, the way her friends entered without really seeing me, how they stepped around me, as if I were just another piece of antique furniture. No greetings that felt real, no thank yous, as I served them drinks or refilled their plates. Not one of them used my name. It was always her mom or the hostess, if they even referred to me at all. I was dust in the corners of the house, unnoticed, until I inconvenienced someone. One young woman, tall and lacquered with an artificial shine, handed me her empty glass without a glance. "Could I get another?" she said, not even a please or thank you. I took the glass. My fingers brushed hers and she recoiled slightly, like I was too cold or too much or too old. I said nothing. I just turned toward the kitchen, cradling the glass like it had feelings I needed to protect. Another guest, he couldn't have been more than 30, propped his feet up on my coffee table, the one my husband built with his own hands. No coaster, just dirt from expensive shoes and entitlement smeared across decades of memory. I watched it happen from across the room. He laughed, leaned back, and threw an arm around my daughter like he owned her. She didn't flinch. She leaned in. They talked about real estate investments, who just got a new Tesla, who got cut off from some unseen pipeline of wealth. It was all foreign to me, not because I didn't understand money, but because I had learned to count value differently, To me, worth was built in hours, not dollars, in meals cooked in laundry, folded in pain, held silently so someone else could sleep easier. I overheard one of them whisper something about the wallpaper. "So, retro," she said, then laughed. I'd picked that wallpaper with my husband the year after our daughter was born. It had daffodils on it. She loved them as a child. Now it was retro, a joke, a remnant of something outdated and embarrassing. I kept moving through the room like a ghost with warm hands, clearing, refilling, adjusting. But every time I tried to make conversation, to offer a story, to step into their world, they shifted, eyes glazed over. Someone would check their phone. The conversation would jolt in a different direction. I felt like a stone thrown into a pond that just didn't ripple. There was a moment when I dropped a fork, just a clatter on the hardwood, and one of the men laughed. "You all right back there?" he said mockingly. I smiled. "Just clumsy," I replied, bending to pick it up. My knees ached. My pride burned. She didn't say anything. My daughter. She could have stepped in. Could have said, "Be nice." Could have reminded them that I was the reason there was even a table to sit at. But she didn't. She was too busy laughing at something someone had said about women who still write checks. The worst part wasn't how they treated me. It was that I'd allowed myself to shrink small enough to accept it. I stood at the edges of that room, decades of love, folded into my apron pockets, and I watched them dance through my memories like tourists in a museum they found boring. They didn't know the stories these walls held. They didn't care. I realized then that the version of me they saw was not the woman I had been, not the woman who had built a life from nothing, who had survived miscarriages and mortgages, who had buried a husband and still woke every morning to make her bed with care. They saw a shadow, a placeholder, a body that moved out of the way. They treated me like dust, and my daughter, she let them. It was almost funny how such a short sentence could slice through years of devotion, like a blade through silk. I hadn't meant to overhear. I never do. But the hallway had always been narrow, and the voices carried. I'd gone to retrieve the guest towels from the cabinet near the powder room, ones I'd embroidered myself years ago, with a little crown motif she used to say was so regal. I thought maybe someone would want to freshen up, maybe it would make things feel more elegant, silly in retrospect. I paused when I heard her voice. Not the casual tone she used for polite company, but her real one, the voice she used when she thought no one was listening. Familiar, unfiltered, sharp. "She actually thinks this is sweet," she was saying. Her voice was coated in disdain. "The cake, the tea, those napkins with the little flowers. It's like she's stuck. In 1982, I swear to God, I hope this is her last birthday." Then laughter. Fast, barking. Her friends joined in without hesitation. Someone muttered, "Seriously, it's exhausting." Another voice added, "She means well, but it's like, let go already." My knees nearly gave out. I leaned against the wall, the towels still pressed to my chest like armor. I couldn't breathe right. The air thinned. I wanted to believe I had misheard, that it was sarcasm, a joke, something taken out of context. But you can always tell when someone's words have weight behind them, and hers, my own daughter's, landed like stones in the pit of my stomach. She hoped it was my last birthday. Not in a wistful, poetic sense, not in the way someone might say last one like this or the end of an era. No, she meant she was tired of me, tired of my love, tired of the small ways I showed up, tried to stay close, tried to matter. I stood frozen for what felt like an hour. The hallway clock ticked. A car passed outside. A laugh rose again from the room beyond like a distant firework. And I just stood there, swallowing grief like broken glass, silent, because silence was the only power I had left in that moment. I didn't walk back into the room right away. I walked to the bathroom and sat on the edge of the tub. I didn't cry. I couldn't. I just stared at the floor tiles, the ones I'd laid myself when her father passed the ones she once painted with her little fingers, while I tried to distract her from grief. That child was gone. That version of her soft, bright-eyed Curious was nowhere in that house anymore, and the woman wearing her face had no space left for me. Eventually, I returned to the gathering. No one noticed my absence. Not really. Someone asked where the towels were. I placed them on the sink and smiled. I don't remember the rest of the night clearly. It passed in a blur of motions, refilling drinks, nodding at conversations, smiling when appropriate. But beneath it all was that sentence circling like a vulture. I hope this is her last birthday. It didn't matter if she meant death or distance. It was a wish made of rejection, a curse disguised as casual speech. And the girl I had once rocked to sleep in her dinosaur pajamas had spoken it, like she was ordering coffee without thought, without care, without love. When the night finally ended and the door closed behind them, I stood in the entryway for a long time. The silence was loud. The leftover cake sat lopsided on the table. A single candle had burned all the way down, wax hardened into a soft puddle. It looked like a tear. I left the dishes. I went to my room. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the closet, wondering what part of me had become so easy to cast aside. And as I lay down still in my clothes, I whispered something back into the dark. Then let it be. The next morning, I woke with that sentence still coiled in my chest like a serpent that had found a warm place to sleep. I moved through the house as if I were underwater, each step slow, each breath thick. The sunlight filtered through the curtains just like it always had, soft and gold, but it didn't warm me. It felt like light meant for someone else, someone still welcome in her own skin. I stood in the kitchen and looked around, seeing my home with new eyes, her eyes maybe. The chipped corner of the cabinet where she used to slam it shut in teenage frustration, now just an eyesore to her friends. The creaking floorboard that used to make her giggle as a child, it was just dated now. I touched the embroidered napkins I'd folded for her party and felt like I was holding a mistake. Everything I had built here, everything I had preserved, cleaned, polished, and poured my spirit into, it suddenly felt like a museum no one wanted to visit. I wasn't just uninvited from her life, I had become a relic, something tolerated, something eventually packed away. I didn't cry, not then. Grief like that doesn't need tears. It settles into your bones, makes your hands tremble when you fold laundry, makes your knees ache when you kneel to wipe crumbs off the floor. I went through the motions that morning, feeding the cat, checking the mail, writing a grocery list, but I felt vacant, like I was performing the role of myself for an invisible audience who had already left. I tried to convince myself it was heat-of-the-moment cruelty, a slip of the tongue. But the truth is, those kinds of words aren't born from nothing. They come from a place that's been rotting for a long time, and maybe I'd ignored it. Maybe I'd chosen to see the best in her for so long that I'd stopped noticing the worst. Later, I found her birthday card in the trash, the one I'd written by hand. 3 pages long, folded carefully, slipped under her gift. It was wedged between a greasy napkin and an empty wine bottle. She hadn't even read it. I could tell by the crispness of the folds. I picked it up and smoothed it out. I reread my own words, my hopes, my memories, my blessings, and they felt like letters sent to a ghost, words meant for a daughter who no longer lived in this world, or at least not in my world. Something broke then. Not loud, not dramatic, just a soft breaking like the final snap of a thread pulled too tight. I placed the card back on the counter, not out of hope she'd see it, but because I didn't want it touching the trash anymore. I think I wanted to preserve it for myself, a little proof that I had tried. That evening I sat alone at the dining table, the same table I had spent hours dressing up the day before. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I just sat there tracing the outline of a faded placemat and letting the silence fill me. It wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that makes you question if your heartbeat is still yours. It hit me then, in that heavy stillness, I was frozen in my own home. Not just by their cruelty, but by my own loyalty. My own refusal to see the signs. I had turned every insult into misunderstanding, every dismissal into stress, every cold glance into a phase, because I was her mother, and mothers endure. But that night the stillness wasn't just a pause, it was a reckoning, a soft declaration rising from the floorboards and the wallpaper and the dishes in the sink. I had given too much of myself away piece by piece, birthday by birthday, until there was almost nothing left to recognize. I didn't rage. I didn't scream. I just sat with the realization that love, when unreciprocated long enough, turns into something bitter, and I'd been drinking that bitterness like tea, pretending it still warmed me. No more. For years, I had measured my worth in acts of care, in birthday cakes and clean laundry and staying up late to sew name labels into school uniforms, in making her favorite stew every time she came home, even if it had been years since she finished the bowl. That's what love looked like to me. Not grand declarations, not constant praise, just presence. Quiet, enduring, reliable presence. I thought that was enough, I truly did. I remember when she was 7 and broke her wrist on the school playground. I stayed overnight at the hospital reading to her from her favorite book, one hand stroking her hair, while the other held the pages steady. I remember when she got rejected from her first job interview, and I made tea and sat with her in the kitchen until the sun came up. I didn't offer solutions. I just listened. I've always listened. And when she got married, God, how I worked to make it perfect. I made the table centerpieces myself, dried every rose petal by hand, embroidered her veil in the same pattern I used on her baby blanket. I thought she noticed. I thought it mattered. Even after she moved out and her calls became less frequent, even as the years pulled her further and further away from me, I held on to the belief that my kind of love was just quiet. That maybe she'd remember it in the still moments of her life, when everything else was too loud. But standing in the middle of my kitchen that morning after her birthday, surrounded by dirty wine glasses and laughter that still echoed like a bruise in the air, I realized something painful I had confused. Endurance with connection. I thought if I just kept giving, kept loving, kept showing up, the relationship would survive. That one day she'd see me again. That she'd turn to me and say, "Thank you for everything." That moment never came. Instead, what came were subtle shifts, her eye rolls when I offered advice, the way she stopped saying "I love you" at the end of calls, how she corrected me in front of her friends, laughing it off like I was a harmless nuisance, and I, so desperate not to rock the boat, laughed along with her, because isn't that what good mothers do? Let their children evolve even when evolution feels like erasure. But now I was beginning to understand that I had enabled this version of her. In my silence, I had permitted it. In my endless giving, I had taught her that I didn't need thanks or kindness or even dignity, just the opportunity to keep giving. I had built a shrine out of sacrifice, and then I was surprised when she worshipped at the altar of herself. I opened my bank book later that day, the one where I kept notes in the margins, the savings account I'd built quietly over the years. Birthday money I never spent. Widow's pension carefully rationed. I had always intended for it to go to her, for her future, for her comfort. It wasn't a fortune, but it was built with love. Love that cost me time, energy, and years of saying no to myself so I could say yes to her. I stared at the balance, my fingers trembling, and for the first time in my life I asked a question that had never dared form fully until now. What if she didn't deserve it? The thought felt monstrous, unnatural. A mother's love is supposed to be unconditional, isn't it? But love without boundaries is not love. It's servitude. And I had confused the two for far too long. I closed the book and placed it back in the drawer, slowly, deliberately, like I was setting down a mirror I no longer needed. And as I stood there, in the quiet of my kitchen with the sunlight flickering across the chipped tile floor, I began to rewrite the story I had told myself for decades. I wasn't enough because I didn't set boundaries. I wasn't seen because I made myself invisible. I wasn't valued because I never asked to be. And that would no longer be the case. It was well past midnight when I heard them again. The house had fallen into that late hush that only comes after too much wine, too much comfort, and too little respect. I was in bed, lights off, door barely cracked, but sleep wouldn't come. The silence was heavy, but not empty. I knew their voices too well by now to mistake them for wind or dream. They were in the living room, close enough that their words reached my bedroom like uninvited guests. "She's sweet, sure," someone said, but she's ancient. Can't even remember what day it is. "She remembers just fine," my daughter replied, and for a flicker of a second I felt a breath of pride. But then came the rest. "She just plays helpless, so people still feel sorry for her." Laughter, not cruel in tone, but careless in spirit. "She'll probably live forever," someone else joked, "just to spite you." I know my daughter sighed, and I can't even say anything without people acting like I'm a monster. More laughter, the kind people use to pretend they're joking when they're really just saying what they believe. "She keeps making everything about her. It's exhausting." "She did host the whole thing," someone mumbled. "I mean, she made all the food." "Yeah," my daughter said, "but that's just her guilt showing. She knows she wasn't the best mom growing up, so now she overcompensates." That one hit differently. Not the best mom. I lay still, breath caught in my throat, like a bird that had flown into glass. For all the nights I stayed up with her, for the sacrifices that didn't fit neatly into Instagram captions, for the pain I swallowed like stones, so she could feel joy I was just a woman, making it about herself. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I stared at the ceiling where shadows danced from the lamplight in the living room. I felt each word like drops of water wearing away stone. Not sharp, not loud, just endless, slow erosion. She's not mean, she's just always there. Always there, like a problem, like clutter. I waited until the conversation turned, until they started talking about some vacation plans or someone's new boyfriend. Then I got out of bed, quietly barefoot, like a ghost in my own hallway. I passed the living room door without looking in. I didn't want to see their faces. Not while they laughed over my ashes, not while the embers of me still smoldered. I went to the kitchen. I poured a glass of water with trembling hands. My reflection in the dark window above the sink looked older than I remembered. Hollow. My nightgown hung loose around my shoulders. I looked like a woman left behind. But then I did something unexpected. I smiled. Not out of joy, not even out of bitterness, but recognition. That was the moment I saw it all clearly. They didn't love me. Not really. They loved the idea of me, the utility of me, the comfort of knowing I'd always be around to clean up the mess, pay the bill, host the party, disappear when inconvenient. They thought I was asleep, and so they told the truth. But so did I in that moment of silence at the kitchen sink. I told myself the truth. I had been avoiding. This wasn't love. This was dependence dressed in resentment. and I had allowed it. I had kept feeding them pieces of myself, hoping they'd be full enough to give something back. But they never were, and they never would be. I returned to my room slower this time. My knees hurt, my back ached, but my mind was clear. I tucked myself under the quilt I had made for her, the one she called Homie. I stared at the stitches and whispered to the darkness, "You don't deserve this part of me anymore." Then I slept, not well, but real sleep. The kind that comes after a long denial finally ends. The next morning the kitchen was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that lingers after people have taken what they wanted and left without saying thank you. The wine glasses were scattered across the counter, smeared with lipstick and half-finished laughter. Plates were stacked unevenly beside the sink, cake hardened at the edges, crumbs like confetti left behind, after a celebration that didn't include me. I didn't turn on music like I usually did. No radio, no humming, just the slow rhythm of water running dishes, clinking my breath steady and tired. I tied my apron the way I always had fingers looping the strings with practiced grace, like muscle memory. It was almost comforting, until I realized what I was doing. Scrubbing, rinsing, polishing their joy while mine lay at the bottom of the sink, soggy and forgotten. I stood there with my hands in the warm, soapy water and tried to will myself not to cry. But it wasn't just tears pressing behind my eyes. It was weight, a heaviness in my chest like a drawer too full to close. I kept my hands busy so my mind wouldn't unravel. That's what we do, isn't it? Women of my generation. When we hurt, we clean. When we break, we sweep it into a corner. When we are betrayed, we make tea. But this time, even the motion felt hollow. I wasn't cleaning a kitchen, I was erasing myself, wiping away the evidence of how hard I had tried. I picked up one of the glasses and turned it over. Lipstick in a color I'd never wear, a rim stained with disregard. And suddenly I was angry. Not loud, fiery anger, but something quieter, cold, like water that's been still too long. I set the glass down, not harshly, just decisively. I walked over to the trash and opened it. The card I had written her was gone. I checked twice. It wasn't there anymore. Maybe she had taken it. Or maybe someone had thrown it out with the rest of the wrapping paper. Either way, it was lost. Like so many of the small invisible offerings I had made through the years. I sat down at the kitchen table, still wearing my apron. My hands were wrinkled from the water. I stared at them, at the lines etched into the skin like roads I'd walked my whole life, roads that always led back to her. And I thought about all the times I had swallowed the hurt for her benefit. Like when she forgot my birthday 3 years in a row. Like when she said I was too sentimental and packed away all the photos from her childhood in a plastic bin. Like when she canceled a lunch I'd cooked for days because something more important came up. I had always made excuses. She's busy. She's tired. She's still finding herself. But how many times does someone forget you before you start to believe you're forgettable? The faucet dripped slowly into the steel sink, each drop like a metronome, marking the beat of my silence. And in that silence something shifted. Not a scream, not a collapse, just a quiet rebalancing, a return to center. I wasn't going to argue with her. I wasn't going to beg for appreciation. I wasn't even going to confront her, not because she didn't deserve the truth, but because she didn't deserve any more of me. Love without respect is a slow death, and I had been dying in teaspoons. I stood up, untied the apron, folded it slowly and placed it over the chair. The kitchen was still messy. There were still dishes in the sink, but I no longer cared. Not because I was done with the mess, but because I was done pretending it was mine to clean alone. She wanted my absence. She wished it in whispers. I would give her space, and in doing so I would give myself something far more precious: peace. That afternoon, I pulled out the worn ledger I kept in the bottom drawer of my writing desk, a simple notebook, spine cracked, pages yellowed, ink faded in places where tears had once blurred the lines. I'd started it when she was 10, maybe 11, a place to track her future, not just money, but memories, intentions, investments of the heart. It wasn't just numbers, it was the story of my devotion handwritten in careful script. The first page was a simple note, for her always, followed by columns of bank deposits, $25 here, $40 there, money set aside from sewing jobs, birthday gifts I never spent on myself, grocery savings turned into dreams. I remembered how proud I was every time I added to it. I didn't earn much after her father passed, but I made it stretch. The account wasn't huge, but it was sacred. A quiet safety net meant to catch her when the world pushed too hard. There were other things, too. A photocopy of the deed to the family house, this house. Her name was penciled in on a note I had attached with a paperclip, scribbled with the words, "To be transferred upon my passing." And beneath that a letter I had written years ago, the kind you write when you're afraid time might outrun your voice. It was soft, full of pride, full of the kind of love that doesn't demand anything in return. A letter she never read, because I never gave it to her. I ran my fingers down the list of dates, concerts she wanted to attend, classes I paid for, when she changed majors 5 times the apartment deposit after her first failed engagement. All of it recorded here, not because I needed proof, but because I thought one day she might want to understand how deeply she had been loved. Looking at it now, it felt like a museum of a life spent giving to someone who no longer believed in legacy, at least not mine. I closed the book and stared at the ceiling, letting the ache settle in. This house had held so much. First steps, first heartbreaks. The wall where I marked her height each year still bore faint lines in pencil, though she once told me to paint over that already. I never did. Because it mattered to me, because she mattered to me. But now those same walls echoed with her contempt, her detachment, her silent wish that I would disappear. She hadn't just distanced herself, she'd erased the parts of me that didn't suit the image she wanted to present to the world. I was no longer a person, I was an inconvenience. And still, despite it all, I had been ready to give her everything. The house, the savings, the jewelry handed down from my grandmother. I had even updated the will to make sure the process would be smooth, simple, thoughtful. But that morning, for the first time in my life, I questioned every line I had written in her favor. Not out of spite, not out of revenge, but out of clarity. Love is not meant to be hoarded by the ungrateful. It is not meant to be handed to those who treat it as currency to be spent and tossed aside. What I had been preparing to leave her wasn't just money or property. It was my life story, the last chapter of my devotion. And she hadn't just rejected it. She'd mocked it, belittled it, hoped it would expire with me. I opened the drawer again and removed the will. A printed copy, signed and notarized. Her name was everywhere, her husband's too. I stared at it the way you might look at a betrayal hiding in plain sight. Then I got up, walked to the shredder and fed the pages through slowly one by one. Not with fury, not with sorrow, with relief. Each strip that fell into the bin below was a line of dialogue I no longer owed her. I stood there for a long time after staring at the empty tray. And for the first time in years, I felt light. It was a Tuesday, the kind of quiet weekday when most people are too busy to notice anything except their own lives. I dressed carefully, nothing fancy, but deliberate. A navy blouse with mother-of-pearl buttons she gave me for Christmas, 1 year back when gifts were still given with care, not obligation. A gray cardigan soft at the elbows, slacks, polished shoes. I looked in the mirror before leaving and told myself out loud, "You don't need permission." The drive to the bank was uneventful, trees blurring past the window radio, murmuring just under the sound of my thoughts. I parked near the entrance and sat in the car for a full minute before stepping out, palms, damp throat dry. Not from fear, but from the enormity of what I was about to do. Not a transaction, not paperwork, a severing, a quiet, irreversible shift. Inside, the air was cold in that sterile way all banks seem to master. I walked slowly, feeling the click of my heels against the tile like a heartbeat. I approached the counter and asked for Meredith, the advisor I had met with years ago, when I first opened the savings account. She was kind, young, but with a softness in her eyes I appreciated. When she appeared, she smiled politely, though I could tell she didn't remember me. "I'd like to make a change to a beneficiary," I said. My voice was steady, almost formal. "I've had a change of plans." She led me to her office and offered coffee. I declined. I didn't want comfort. I wanted clarity. She pulled up the account on her screen, tapping gently with her pen. "So currently, the beneficiary is—" "I know who it is," I interrupted, not harshly, just tired. "I want to remove her." A pause, a professional flicker of surprise. "Okay," she said softly. "Would you like to name a new one?" I hesitated. I had thought about this part. I had lain awake at night wondering what would be more painful, to reassign the legacy or to let it drift somewhere impersonal. But now, in the stillness of that small, glass-walled office, I knew exactly what I wanted. "Yes," I said. "I'd like to split it. Half to a local women's shelter, the other half to the community college's nursing scholarship fund." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure," I said, and I meant it. As she typed, I watched her hands move, capable young hands still unmarked by decades of sacrifice, and yet they were helping me write the ending of a chapter I thought would never close. She handed me a form. I signed it. Another form, another signature. With each stroke of the pen, I felt lighter. It wasn't joy. Joy would be too bright a word for what I felt. It was something deeper, something quieter, like a room being swept clean for the first time in years. When it was done, she smiled again, this time with something different behind her eyes. Respect, maybe, or understanding. "You're making a real difference," she said. I nodded, but I didn't say thank you. Not because I wasn't grateful, but because I didn't want to frame it as charity. What I had done wasn't a gift. It was reclamation. I had reclaimed my story from the hands of someone who had rewritten me into something small. As I left the bank and stepped out into the sun, something shifted in my body. My shoulders rolled back. My spine straightened. I breathed in the air like it was mine to breathe fully without apology. This was my legacy now, not bound by blood, but by choice. I no longer needed my daughter to carry my name forward. I would live on in warm beds at the shelter and textbooks, opened under dim dormitory lights, in the steady hands of nurses who would never call an old woman a burden. And if my daughter ever wondered why, if she ever asked someday what happened to the inheritance, I wouldn't have to say a word. The silence would be her answer. After the bank visit, something inside me stilled, not in the way grief stifles, but in the way still water reflects. It was subtle at first. I didn't make a grand speech. I didn't call her to announce what I'd done. I didn't need to. Some truths don't require declarations. They simply shift the way you carry your own name. The kitchen, once a place I haunted with purpose, felt different now, lighter. I no longer hovered at the countertops, anticipating the needs of people who never noticed the effort. I cooked for myself again small meals with real herbs, the kind I'd stopped using because she once said my food tasted too earthy. I made tea with fresh mint from the backyard and drank it slowly by the window. For the first time in years, the ritual of eating didn't revolve around anyone else's approval. She called that weekend. I let it ring twice before picking up. Her voice was brisk, efficient, asking about an upcoming family event who was bringing what. I answered plainly, gave no extra softness. She noticed. I heard the slight pause in her tone, like someone catching a draft from a door they thought was closed. "Are you all right, Mom?" she asked. "I'm fine," I replied. That was it. I didn't offer stories or warmth to fill the silence. I let her sit in it, feel the absence of my usual emotional labor. It made her uncomfortable. I could hear it. I began speaking less in general, not out of spite, but from exhaustion. There is a special kind of tired that comes from being unheard for too long. It drains your voice, makes you careful with your offerings. I had wasted too many years translating my love into chores, folding it into casseroles, and perfectly ironed blouses, hoping she'd see the message buried beneath each gesture. Now I let her learn the language of absence. The next time she visited, she brought wine, a small peace offering. "Thought you'd like this," she said, placing it on the counter. I nodded, didn't open it. I watched her as she moved around the kitchen like a stranger, her fingers grazing the countertops she once wiped down as a teenager. She didn't ask questions. She didn't apologize. But she watched me carefully, the way people watch a painting they forgot the meaning of. She asked what I was working on these days. I told her I had been reading again, writing a bit. Writing, she echoed like the word tasted odd in her mouth. I didn't elaborate. She didn't press. That was the new rhythm of our exchanges, shallow waters, short visits. No more performances, no more backbending for affection that came only in droplets. I noticed she didn't open the pantry this time, didn't inspect what was stocked, didn't ask what was for dinner. Maybe she felt the change. Maybe she sensed that something had shifted and the old patterns no longer fit. I watched her leave that evening, her heels clicking down the walkway. She didn't turn to wave. She rarely did. But this time I didn't watch the car until it turned the corner. I closed the door after it shut, locked it, went to the living room and lit a candle just for me. I sat in the quiet glow and exhaled the version of myself I used to perform, the always available mother, the good hostess, the gracious giver. I had played her for decades. She had served her purpose. She could rest now. There was peace in that kitchen, not the kind that comes from cleanliness, but from boundaries. The table was still there, the one we had sat around for so many years, but now it was mine again. No centerpiece, no party favors, just a vase with fresh lavender and a stack of books I had been meaning to finish. The shift was quiet, yes, but it was mine. That night, long after the dishes were done and the lights dimmed, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea and a fountain pen I hadn't touched in years, the same one I used to write letters to her when she was away at camp, when she'd ask for home updates, and tuck the pages under her pillow at night. I used to believe in the magic of handwritten words, the kind that carried warmth across distances. So many of my letters had been for others, especially her, but this one I decided would be for me. I pulled out a sheet of thick stationery, cream-colored with a faint floral watermark. I placed it gently on the table and let my hand hover over it for a moment. Then I wrote at the very top, "Dear me." I paused. The words looked foreign, like they belonged to someone wiser. But I kept writing. You did your best, even when no one said so, even when the room stayed quiet after all the meals, the favors, the birthdays, the apologies you offered before anyone asked for them. You showed up. You tried. You loved louder than anyone ever listened. The words spilled slowly like sap from a tree, thick, honest. You endured being made small. You endured being erased. You endured their sideways glances, their muffled jokes, their polite avoidance of your feelings. And still, you loved them. But it is no longer your job to set yourself on fire to keep anyone else warm. My hand trembled, but I didn't stop. I had more to say to the woman who had lived quietly in the corners of other people's needs. You were never just a mother. You were a woman, a creator of warmth, a keeper of stories. And even if they didn't listen, even if they left you out of their laughter, you remained intact. That is not weakness. That is grace. I thought of all the years I had watched her grow, how I folded my identity into hers, thinking that her success would redeem my sacrifices. I had waited so long for her to say I mattered, and now sitting in the still of my own kitchen, I realized I no longer needed her permission to believe I did. Let them think what they want, I wrote. Let them misunderstand. Let them call you dramatic or too sensitive. They don't know what it takes to hold a family in your hands and not let it break even while your own bones are aching. I signed the letter softly, not as mom or mother, but simply with my name, the one I was given before she was ever born, the one I had forgotten I could still use. Then I folded the letter and tucked it into the notebook where I had recorded the savings account, the donations, the new will. It didn't need to be mailed. It didn't even need to be read again. It just needed to be written, to be real, to exist. There was something sacred in telling the truth without expecting a response. That evening I sat on the front porch for a while. The sky was a soft, bruised blue stars beginning to peek through. The wind moved gently through the hydrangeas I'd planted with her father so many years ago, the ones she said made the yard look old-fashioned. I smiled. Maybe it did, but I loved them anyway. I thought of all the moments I had lost to trying to be smaller, easier, more likable, trying to belong in a space that had already emptied itself of me. And I thought of how easy it would be to go on pretending. But not anymore. That letter was a line in the sand, a reminder that my story didn't need to be reinterpreted by the next generation to have value, that I had lived, loved, suffered, and risen in ways no child could ever fully grasp. And that was enough. The porch light flickered above me as I stood up and went inside. The world was still spinning. My name was still mine. And now so was my story. It sat at the top of my closet for years, an old wooden box lined with velvet. The hinges rusted just slightly, but still firm. Inside were the things I had set aside slowly, quietly, over a lifetime. Not because they were valuable in the way banks measure worth, but because they held meaning, history, proof that I had been here, that I had cared. There was the pearl necklace from my own mother passed to me with trembling hands the night before my wedding, a silver hairbrush set I'd once admired in a shop window and received unexpectedly the year she was born, her first tooth still wrapped in tissue, the deed to the cottage her father and I bought when we believed in forever, and most recently, a neatly folded stack of papers bearing the final signatures from the lawyer documents that removed her name from everything I had once promised. I took my time wrapping each item, one last act of tenderness not for her, but for the woman I used to be, the one who had saved all these things with such hope. I placed them in a gift box, each wrapped in old birthday tissue paper I had hoarded in a drawer for reuse. A bow not too large, a card unsigned, and no note inside, no explanation, no accusation. It was the first birthday in years that I hadn't called her first thing in the morning. No cheerful voicemail, No happy birthday, sweetheart. No custom cake order. I simply placed the box on her porch just before dawn. Quietly. The sky was still gray, the world not yet awake. I stood there for a few minutes, my breath visible in the chill. I looked at the door I had once walked through with armfuls of groceries and casseroles. The same one she had closed behind me 2 Christmases ago, with barely a goodbye. I didn't knock. I didn't want to see her face contort with confusion or worse, pity. I just left it there and walked away. Inside that box wasn't just jewelry or paper. It was a farewell, my final gift, the only one I'd give again. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't a message wrapped in spite. It was a ceremony, an ending, a full stop at the end of a sentence I had written in love and now was ready to close. I spent the rest of the day differently than I usually did. No calls, no checking social media to see if she'd posted photos, no waiting by the phone for a thank you or another cutting silence. I took a long walk instead through the park, past the pond where I used to take her to feed the ducks. The wind stirred gently through the reeds, and I found myself smiling at nothing in particular. It felt good not to be waiting. It felt even better to have chosen to stop. Later that evening, I made myself a simple meal lentil soup with fresh rosemary warm bread and a small glass of wine. I lit a candle, played music I loved but hadn't listened to in years because she once said it sounded too sad. It didn't feel sad tonight. It felt true. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I looked around my room, and noticed how everything looked more vivid. The corners weren't shadows anymore. They were stories. The furniture wasn't dated. It was lived-in solid. The air wasn't still. It was calm. She didn't call that night. I didn't expect her to. But I imagined her opening that box. I imagined her looking at the necklace, the brush, the deed, the heirlooms carefully placed in silence. I imagined the weight of it landing in her chest, not as punishment, but as realization. Or maybe not. Maybe it would just confuse her, spark frustration, another round of eye-rolling explanations to friends who would never understand the depth of what she'd lost. But that wasn't my concern anymore. I had given her everything once. Now I had given her goodbye. It didn't take long. 2 days, maybe 3. I was clipping dead leaves from the rose bushes when I heard the car pull into the driveway. The tires crunched the gravel in that familiar, impatient rhythm. I didn't turn to look. I kept pruning slow and methodical as though I didn't know a storm was about to land behind me. The car door slammed. Mom. Her voice was sharp, higher pitched than usual, like someone trying to stay composed while their breath escapes them. I stood up, slowly, brushed my palms on my apron and turned around. She was already holding the box. It looked smaller in her hands than it had in mine. She gripped it too tightly, the bow slightly crushed the velvet-lined edges, dulled by confusion. "What is this?" she demanded. No greeting. No smile. I tilted my head slightly. A gift. "Don't be cryptic," she snapped. "What's going on?" I walked past her toward the porch, wiping a smear of dirt from my sleeve. "You opened it, didn't you?" "Yes, and I don't understand." Her voice cracked. "Why is the deed in here? Why are you giving me this stuff like it's a goodbye?" I sat down on the porch swing. The cushions were still warm from the sun. She didn't sit. "It is a goodbye," I said calmly. "The kind that doesn't need a party or a cake. Just space, just peace." She blinked hard. I saw her chest rise and fall with the beginning of panic, the kind that comes not from being hurt, but from losing control. "What did you do?" "I changed the will, the accounts, everything. It's no longer yours." She opened her mouth to argue, to launch into the performance I knew so well. Confusion, Disbelief, guilt, turned anger. But I raised a hand gently, like a conductor, quieting an orchestra before the first note. You said you hoped it was my last birthday. Her mouth dropped slightly, then closed again. I didn't. You did, I said not unkindly. And even if you hadn't, you've been saying it with your eyes for years. You stopped visiting unless you needed something. You stopped listening. You stopped seeing me as a person. She stepped back like she'd been slapped. I didn't mean. You did, I repeated. And that's all right. You're allowed to feel what you feel. But so am I. The silence between us stretched taut and trembling. The birds continued chirping. A breeze rustled through the lavender. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked. The world didn't pause to witness the fracture, it simply moved on. She looked down at the box in her hands as if expecting it to offer some hidden message, some chance at reversing what had already been done. Her eyes flicked up to mine. I thought you loved me. I smiled, not bitterly, not cruelly. I did. I do. But I also love myself now, and loving you no longer means losing me. Her hands tightened around the edges of the box. I don't want your stuff. Then give it away. Burn it. Keep it. It's not a test. It's just what's left. I stood. My legs were stiff but steady. I walked past her down the steps toward the garden. The air smelled of earth and lemon balm. My hands found the shears again, returning to the work that had waited patiently through our exchange. She stood there for a while, silent, and then turned and left without another word. The car pulled away faster this time, tires skidding slightly on the gravel. I didn't watch her go. I snipped a wilting rose from its stem and dropped it gently into the compost bin. The peace that followed was immediate, whole, not because she was gone, but because I had finally stopped needing her to come back as someone she was not. Let her make her stories. Let her tell the world what she thinks happened. I had lived my part loved through mine, and now I was writing the ending. Not with revenge, but with release. The following week I met with the director of the women's shelter just across town, a modest place, with peeling paint and warm eyes. I'd visited once before, years ago, to drop off blankets, but this time I wasn't bringing leftovers. I was bringing legacy. She greeted me with a handshake that lingered, the kind of grip that says, "You're seen." Her name was Anna. She didn't ask why I was there until we'd sat down over coffee, mismatched mugs, clinking gently on a table full of paper stacks and crayon drawings left behind by small, frightened hands. I'd like to make a donation, I said, unfolding the new documents I had just received from the bank and the lawyer, in my daughter's name. Anna blinked. In her name? Yes, I replied. I want her to be remembered here, not because of what she did, but because of what I chose to do despite it. She didn't press further. I could tell she understood. Some women know the language of quiet betrayal before it's even spoken aloud. We filled out the forms together. The funds would go toward repairing the nursery wing, adding books to the library, and starting a new program for women rebuilding their lives after leaving homes filled with fear and silence. As we signed the final line, I imagined her name etched into a brass plaque above the door, not as a tribute to her deeds, but as a symbol of reclamation, that her name, once a source of ache, would now be carved into something that helped others heal. The next day I called the local community college. The scholarship division welcomed the offer with a kind of stunned gratitude. I told them to direct the funds specifically to young women entering nursing programs, girls who didn't have parents paying their tuition, girls who were building their futures from nothing but grit and hope. I asked for no ceremony, no photo op, no plaque. Just do good with it, I said. And that was that. After the calls were done, the paperwork filed. I sat in the garden with my hands in the soil. I pulled weeds, patted fresh compost around the roots of the mint, and smiled as a honeybee landed on my thumb. I felt light, not happy exactly, but untethered. There is something sacred in giving without demand, in releasing something you once clung to with all your strength, and watching it bloom elsewhere away from your hands. People ask questions, of course. A few relatives reached out confused. She must have told them, spun her story of betrayal, of coldness, of a mother who just changed. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain. You don't owe explanations to people who only ask so they can judge your answer. And she didn't call. Not after the box. Not after the discovery. Silence finally had become the shared language between us, but where hers came from disdain, mine came from peace. Because while she sat in her curated life, I had stitched something lasting from the remains. I imagined a young woman reading her scholarship acceptance letter, eyes wide with disbelief. I imagined a mother holding her child in a warm bed, donated through those funds. I imagined strangers passing through those spaces, never knowing my face, but feeling the ripples of what I chose to do. Not out of spite, not out of revenge, but because I refused to let bitterness be the final chapter of my story. She once said, I hope this is her last birthday, and maybe it was the last birthday where I begged to belong. The last time I poured love into a well with no bottom. But what she didn't understand is that her words were not a death sentence. They were a birth cry, not of an ending, but of an arrival. Of the moment I remembered my own name, of the moment I stopped being her mother first and became my own woman again. The days are quieter now, slower, but not lonely. There's a softness to this kind of solitude, the kind that isn't about being alone, but about finally returning to yourself after decades of being stretched thin. I move through my home like it's mine again. I light candles not for ambiance, but because I enjoy the scent. I water my garden in the mornings and read in the afternoons without glancing at the clock, without wondering if someone needs something from me. When I think of her, it's not with anger anymore. It's with distance, a gentle, necessary space. I don't replay her words or try to decode the coldness. I don't wonder if she misses me. That used to hurt. Now it's just a fact, like the rain or the wind or the way hydrangeas bloom late in the season. Some endings are just beginnings with the noise turned off. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just needed to remember my worth. She got what she asked for. And I got free.